So just to introduce you, as I say, to the concepts around virtual reality and then how typography sort of fits within that, and to go through some basic principles. So kind of just an overview of the workshop and what I'm going to be talking about this morning. So I want to talk a little bit about what is virtual reality, and I'm sure Rob will also join in here, but to talk about a definition of it. Then to look at basic principles, basic concepts around virtual reality. Also to speak specifically about the audience experience, and then to look at examples of typography, and also to say that, you know, there are few and far between examples of virtual reality typography. It's a very much a new and emerging area. So, you know, it's an opportunity during the workshop for you to make something possibly that nobody else has made. So, you know, these early examples, you're kind of blazing a trail here in terms of, you know, experimenting with typography in virtual space. So yeah, we'll talk about some examples of spatial typography, 2D, 3D, and in and on and a 3D environment. And then we'll talk about structural typography, some examples of virtual reality typography, and then we'll just go through an outline of the workshop schedule and process. Okay, so let's just start off with, I suppose, reality. Technologies have always, they've been developing, obviously, you know, over the last century and into this century, particularly in the last kind of 10, 15 years at a rapid rate. But there have been technologies around for quite a while around these areas. So I just want to talk a little bit about the differences, and to start off with the concept of, you know, I suppose all forms of art and media, we've been trying to recreate our own realities, representations of that, and then present them back to an audience to provoke a response or some type of engagement. So we're going to talk a little bit about three types: augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality, and just to kind of explain the difference and then to explain what we are going to be doing. So if you think about TV, TV is you know, it's a representation of reality on a 2D surface that we watch, and that, you know, it's full high fidelity, it's real life. But we as an audience, we're on the outside of that representation. So even though cinema and television is incredibly immersive and engaging, we're still outside of that representation. So if somebody, you know, walks across the room in front of the TV, that interrupts our viewing. We get distracted because, as I say, we're on the outside. In augmented reality, it's becoming more common. This is where we can insert augmentation or graphics or I suppose man-made things, simulated things into our reality, into our real world. And we do this through devices like the mobile phone or like a headset. So have any of you played Pokemon Go or anything like that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. So you're familiar. I mean, the thing is, folks, you're of a generation where you're growing up with this stuff, whereas myself and Rob, you know, this is all very new and exciting. I mean, to us, it's kind of futuristic when we see things like this. So I don't know if any of you saw the at the beginning of lockdown last year, Google, there was a little application of an animal, like a real life animal that you could insert into your environment on your phone. It was on Google, you could find it, a tiger. And it was really quite like fascinating. And it went viral during lockdown. Everybody was sending it around on their phones because it was just so novel. The idea of being able to, you know, use your phone and project a virtual reality or an augmented reality tiger or giraffe or crocodile into your living room. So anyway, I'll give you the link for that later. So the thing is, augmented reality is basically where we can use devices such as headsets or phones to insert overlays or augmentation in our own reality to help us hopefully improve our surroundings, to give us more information, and to help us do our work, or even to create enjoyment. And as we heard in the introductory lecture there, there's also downside to all of these things, to technology. So we need to have some awareness of all of the kind of the issues that may occur. So just for example, with augmented reality, where you're inserting something into somebody's, you know, real world, you also have the issues of, you know, could it obstruct their view? So if you imagine in the future where you might have an augmented reality windscreen in your car, designers are going to have to be very careful about that, how, you know, those overlays, those interfaces come up and not obstruct their vision so that it might cause an accident and whatnot. So this is an example of manufacturing, engineering, where there's complex machinery, and, you know, here the engineer on site can call up augmented reality and can see, you know, the part of the manual, for example, that they might need to see about the machine, instead of having to have a, you know, a 1,000-page document beside them, or even to scroll through that on the website, but to call it up in context. So augmented reality is about being able to insert things into the world in context, in the context for where you are at the time. I don't know if any of you have used Google Maps in an augmented reality format. Has anybody used that?
Yes.
Yes. So did you?
Not as much.
Not as much.
Like if I was excited to see what Basel looked like from India before coming here, then
Yes.
go on like just Street View to sort of get an idea.
Well, it's funny, myself and Rob were teaching in Helsinki a couple of years ago, and we went to a museum out in the suburbs, and we took I think it was a bus, wasn't it, Rob? And we got, the point was it stopped in this giant train station that had multiple exits, and we we were trying to find the museum was very nearby, but we couldn't find our way out of this train station. But we used Google augmented reality Google Maps, and I had never used it before, and it was it was first person in situ, so it overlaid the arrows in the streets where we were walking, and it was really helpful. So it's the first time I went, oh, this really, really worked. But I'm sure anyway, you'll have other examples of it. And again, I've supervised a few of my students, master students, designing, you know, augmented reality interfaces, and there's lots of issues, you know, that still are very much early days in terms of trying to solve these problems. You can see from this image, you know, the skeuomorphism, you know, the idea of it having to exist in a 3D space, and then, you know, as you turn your head, does the interface move with you? You know, what distance do you put it from the reader, and all of that. So there's lots of issues to consider. Then we have what we call, I suppose, this is virtual reality, but it's not, we're still not talking about the virtual reality where we are submerged inside the representation. Now, this is a first person view, but this would be very typical of computer games where we have a simulated reality. So it is virtual in the sense that, you know, the physical environment is created on the computer, and more they're becoming so realistic. It's incredible. You know, like the latest, you know, computer games are really, you know, jaw dropping. Even I was just looking at one, my son was playing the Star Wars, the latest Star Wars one, the Fallen Jedi, I think it was, and just the quality of the graphics, and, you know, the fact that you can fly in a spaceship and all of that, it's so realistic. It's even better than the quality of the graphics in the movies, you know, in the original movies. So the kind of the line between these simulated, these you know, synthetic environments that are created in 3D programs is becoming very, very close to our actual reality. And then we have mixed reality. So again, you may well have seen this. This is a very famous kind of trailer from the Magic Leap, which is kind of, I suppose, one of the first mixed reality technologies / headsets. And this is the idea where, again, we can simulate augmentation in our real world, but this looks like real augmentation. So this doesn't look like computer graphics. This looks like a real whale. It's footage of a real whale, but it's placed within a real world. So now you're entering a sphere where you're looking at, you know, science fiction effectively. If you put a headset on here, you know, a virtual reality headset, you can be in the presence of this whale jumping out of the floor of a gym. So it actually feels like you are present looking at this. And as you turn your head, the physical space is this place. So you're transported there. So this is where virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, you can see how they collide. But I guess the key thing for virtual reality is, with virtual reality, we tend to put a headset on, which blocks out, which puts us inside the representation. And that's why it's different from augmented reality. That's why it's different from television reality, because suddenly we're inside the representation. So if you can imagine a future where you're inside your favorite TV show and you can interact with the actors and so on and be part of that, that is where we're headed with entertainment from a virtual reality standpoint. Okay. And then mixed reality / augmented reality. I mean, these will be, again, this is an example of the Magic Leap. But the idea here is you have a headset and you can suddenly play the game, a first-person shooter with all of that, but inside your own reality environment. So you're overlaying the graphics and the sprites and the engine, the graphic engine, but it's, instead of rendering just the virtual environment of the game, this is the actual your environment, and these are being rendered real time in the physics of your environment. So that's really kind of far out there for us to grasp if you think about it. And again, there's lots and lots of movies that have portrayed that example, that sort of future of what reality is. Rob, do you want to say anything there about virtual reality?
Yeah. So I suppose, like, you know, if you're a fully visual person, you know, you've got fully sighted, your vision is your strongest sense. So the feeling of being present somewhere is interesting. And it's, you know, you're sitting in a room now in front of your laptop or your computer or your phone even. And, you know, you can feel your chair, you feel presence where you are. But it's kind of strange at the moment. It's like we're in two places. We're like together in one form and we're separate in another. So I think that juxtaposition is really interesting, and it's something that the cyber psychology students look at a lot. And this feeling of presence, it's interesting how the eyes can be tricked. Okay, our vision isn't as good as we think it is. Our what's in focus is actually quite small, right? You know, like if you were to hold your hands out like this, only the tips of your fingers come into focus. It's all like a lot. Your peripheral vision can be quite blurry. You know, it doesn't if you if everybody does this, right? So it's only about 2 to 5% of our vision is in focus when we're looking around. So our eyes are darting around a lot. But what this means is that our eyes can be tricked. So you've all seen like optical illusions, and we can kind of get into things very easily. And it's an interesting factor. And we had a guest speaker over. Her name's Brita Weinberg. She's a therapist in Los Angeles, and she gave a talk in IADT. And someone said, like, she was using a virtual airplane to teach people with a fear of flying, so they could overcome this fear of flying. And the airplane didn't look that realistic. It was kind of an old one. And she said that the people still felt present in it, right? So they were immersed in it. So we get used to things really quickly. So if you've got a virtual environment, like there's a game, it's, you know, Rick and Morty, anyone like that animation? It's like a cartoon world, but it's amazing how quickly it becomes normal, right? So once someone's there, and after a couple of minutes, it's totally normal. I attended a virtual meetup using VR, and we were all characters, like almost like cartoon characters. But it was funny, after about 5 minutes of talking to people, yeah, actually could even recognize people. I knew a few people there, and you could tell by the way they moved and everything, and their voice, obviously. So you can become immersed in something quite quickly and quite easily. And then the other one is sound as well. So sound plays a large part, and it tells us what direction sounds are in, and it lets us know what's happening in another room even, or, you know, you could hear an airplane flying over. So that feeling of where something is very powerful. Another thing you find in VR is this feeling of space. So going from a small space into a big space. Do you ever go through, like a football player going out the tunnel into the stadium, that feeling of going into somewhere big? You really feel that. And vertigo as well, so the feeling of heights. A lot of people, like a lot of the VR experiences, use that. There's one that we used to, I was at a thing called Coder Dojo, which is where kids learn how to code here in Dublin. And we set up a plank, and we had the kids walk the plank as if they were going off the side of a building, and they were all screaming and thought they were up really high, right? Even though they know they're only like an inch off the ground. That feeling of being present somewhere else is very strong. And if you want to laugh, if you go onto like YouTube and type in VR fail, you'll find there's hours and hours of videos of people playing VR and maybe like a zombie's coming towards them and they're jumping out of the way, or they think they're on a roller coaster and they fall out of the chair and things like that, because people do definitely feel very immersed quite easily. So you can make something that's quite immersive, and it doesn't necessarily have to be photorealistic. So how I suppose the question might be, how do you measure that? So one way is just the physical, right? So if somebody like moves out of the way, it'll say there's like something coming towards you and they duck. That's a sign that they're feeling present, and that feeling of heights as well. And there's a couple of questionnaires that we use to measure people's presence as well. And then you've also got the biological, so heart rate increases or temperature increases and things like that. So there's a few ways of measuring how present people feel. But I think the big takeaway I just want to give you from this bit is that even if something isn't that realistic looking, people definitely do feel like they're present there and like they are somewhere else, which I think is a really interesting, like from the psychology point of view, that this ability to put people in different situations. Because I know, like, we're an art college. I'm not teaching on the art side, but I love going over and when they have things like they have exhibitions and they do things like installations, right? So you might go into a room and there'll be something in there, and that's designed to make you feel a certain way or to tell you something, and they're doing it all using a space, which is what we'll be doing. So you can recreate that virtually. And I suppose now, since we're on a lockdown here at the moment anyway, but this idea of being able to meet other people and like even be close to them, I found an app. It was a virtual rave, and you're able to be there. But all the other people there were actually other individuals, like, and they could come up and they could talk to you and things. And actually, I'd used it during we had a lockdown there for a good while, and it felt strange being in a crowd, right? That feeling of being in a crowd of other people. So it can recreate lots of different situations. So I think it's definitely something that will become more popular in the future. The price of the headsets is dropping dramatically. The first one I bought was €1,000. That was about 6 years ago, and now for about 3 or 4, you can get like the
Quest 2 is about €300.
300, which is
and the quality is astonishing.
And it's much better than that first one. So I think in a couple of years they'll be in Lidl or Aldi, right? You'll be able to buy a headset. You know, they'll be like 50, €100. You know, so it's definitely something that will become a lot more common, and we're all getting used to communicating virtually as well. So this would add, like, what's missing here is that feeling of presence. You know, it's simulated a little bit, but like if we all had headsets on and we all had avatars and we could all be in the same room, you could definitely improve or increase that feeling of presence. And there's a lot of companies doing that at the moment, making like a virtual reality version of Zoom or Skype. There's a few of them already where people can have virtual meetings. So that I'll stop now. I'll hand you back to Hilary. But
so anyway, thanks, Rob. Like he's a minefield of information, so he can talk for hours about this. So we'll be picking his brains as the week goes on. So just to sum up, look, virtual reality, it's an interactive computer-generated experience taking place within a simulated immersive environment, incorporating auditory and visual feedback and sometimes sensory or haptic feedback. So just before we kind of get into the specifics of virtual reality, I just wanted to say, I'm not going to give you a history lesson on virtual reality, but to say that, look, you know, inventors, engineers, designers, you know, computer scientists, for literally since the kind of early 1930s, they have been trying to investigate ways to kind of stimulate our virtual, you know, to represent reality and how we might interact with that. You know, as early as kind of 1935, you had things like you know, stereoscopic spectacles, you know, where you could see kind of an illusion of a 3D image. And then in the 60s, you had Ivan Sutherland kind of invent the first helmet display. So this is where, as I say, where you put this over your head and you're inside something that's a representation, so you're immersed in it. And then you had the military develop simulators for flying. You know, again in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And, you know, the issue around virtual reality is it's always been quite expensive to develop the hardware to create these immersive experiences. And that has been why it's been slow to I suppose, to become popular. But now the headsets are getting much lighter and the quality is getting much better. So it's exactly like our screens and our phones. The resolution is getting better and better. They're getting cheaper. They're getting smaller. But there's still a lot of issues. So as I say, you know, at the moment, we work very intensively in IDT with cyber psychologists. And anybody who undertakes a virtual reality design project has to go through our ethics committee, because there's quite a lot of kind of health and safety guidelines around virtual reality. For example, you can't allow your user to be in it for more than 10 or 15 minutes. 10 minutes, I think, is what we have capped it at, or they could feel unwell, or it could have adverse effects. So there's a lot of interesting things like that. And as I say, you know, stuff like, I don't know if you've ever had a go of virtual reality, or have any of you tried it out?
You mean try virtuality?
Yes. Have you ever put on a headset or had a go, you know, tried it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And did you ever get a feeling of motion sickness in any of the applications that you used?
It was quite a short time. Like, it was like 2 minutes. So not
yes.
really.
Yeah. So I think if you do have the opportunity to try a headset, that is something, you know, I mean, I tried lots of different applications, and some of them make you feel really sick. And the ones that make you feel really sick are the ones that make you feel like you're moving. So even if you're not, they what happens is you get this kind of sense of, but like you're falling, or so it's basically, it's traveling too fast for your senses to catch up with. So you get this sense of falling, and there's a lot of science around that. But so this is why you have to be so careful not to design those types of experiences into the virtual reality, but still create a feeling of immersion. Okay, so I thought we'd have a little look at, because film, I think, is probably something you're most familiar with in terms of, you know, examples of virtual reality, but I'm sure you're very au fait with the most recent ones. But I just thought I would show you an example. This is a film that was made in 1994 by director Barry Levinson, and I'm going to just post because I'm sure this clip won't work if I try to run it through Teams. So I'll just post the link in the chat, and if you want to just open your browser and just click on the link, and I'd just like you to watch that little clip for a couple of minutes. So could everybody confirm that they can see the link in the chat? So you can stop watching it now. I just want to talk about a few of the things in it, which is quite interesting. So we spoke about, Rob was speaking there about presence. What did you notice about Michael Douglas is the main character who entered the virtual reality? What did you notice about him? Can anybody notice what happened to him when he put on the headset?
He's getting scanned.
Yes. And what did you see then? You saw him represented inside of the virtual environment. Did everybody see that? His hands became visible, and his head, and so on. So in current virtual reality, that isn't actually that isn't really happening. So we're still struggling with the physical representation of ourselves in virtual reality. So we don't have a real life avatar per se, like a synthetic version of ourselves. Currently, we don't have that. So that's quite interesting. 40 years ago, they were already thinking about the problem of presence and being disembodied, you know, just like what Rob was saying. So you can be physically, you can physically seem like you're there, but in terms of your physical body, you're not there. You're just like a ghost. you exist. You can look around and everything, but you don't actually exist in the space. So that also can be disconcerting. Did you notice that you were looking through his eyes through the headset? Did everybody get that sense from it as well? Okay, and it looked like you could see things were lighting up when he looked at them, like his gaze. So when he directed his gaze at things, they highlighted. So again, you can watch the clip back later. So there's some kind of basic fundamental ideas that are still relevant in that clip. You also saw when he walked to a precipice, it looked like he was going to fall over. So exactly what I was talking about there. And again, it cuts back to the hotel room where he's standing on this little plinth, this little platform where he has the headset on. And you can see how ridiculous it seems when you look at the reality versus the virtual reality. Okay. So again, this is why it's completely immersive. When he's inside that, his whole real world is totally blocked out. And the other thing that's interesting here is the representation of the real world. So you could see he was actually inside a database. So again, if we all conceptualize a database, it's data inside ones and zeros in a computer. So they created like a physical virtual building where the data was stored, and he's searching through the files as if it was real. So it's using the metaphor of files, of real files in the real world. Okay, so let me just go back here. Okay, so I think it's quite interesting. The next clip I'm going to show then is, has everybody seen Minority Report? Everybody seen? Sorry, oops. Has everybody seen Minority Report? The movie Minority Report. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
No.
The rest of you, please tell me you've seen that one. That was 2002. Are you still? You're probably still too young. Okay. So I tell you what, folks, I'm going to also put that in the chat because I think this is definitely also worth you having a little look at. So just bear with me, and I will put an example in the chat. Okay, so can you see that, folks?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so just take a moment to have a look at this. So this is a film by Steven Spielberg, and it's in 2002. It was made in 2002, and it's based around the idea of a short story, Philip K. Dick, who's a science fiction writer. And this is cast in the future, and Tom Cruise, who I think you hopefully know, is an actor in this, and he is what they call, he's a policeman, I guess. He's part of kind of like a future FBI type agency. And in this future, they can predict crime. So they have these kind of synthetic robot sort of beings that are connected to a database, and they're called precogs is their name. So precognition, they have precognitions about crimes that are going to happen in the future. And this agency, they can look through the precog database and they can stop crimes before they happen. So this little sequence is Tom Cruise interacting with the database. So have a look at it, folks, and see what you think. Okay, folks, did you have a chance to have a little look at that?
Yeah, I feel like Tom Cruise makes it look and feel better.
Yeah, exactly. I'd say there's quite a lot of usability problems with that interface.
Yeah.
But so I think it's quite interesting just to put those side by side in terms of, the distance, like even 30 years apart, and the representations of these kind of future interfaces. And, you can see here like typography and the user interface elements, they exist in this crazy kind of spatial environment. And, he's just flicking things forwards and backwards. So gesture. So he's physically there, but it's almost like it's this, in this representation, it's almost like this is just a kind of a virtual reality screen. So he's not in a headset. He's still outside the representation, but yet it's present in his own real space, his own reality. So again, just some quite interesting different representations. And look, there's a ton of examples. I mean, probably the one that comes to mind for everybody is Ready Player One. I think that was Steven Spielberg again. This would be 20 years later. Steven Spielberg tackles the concept of virtual reality, and have you all seen that movie? Ready Player One. Has anybody seen that?
Yeah, I saw it not a long time ago.
Okay, well,
It's
again,
on Netflix.
it's on Netflix. It's worth a look just to give you the kind of, again, just this kind of speculative, I suppose, future about the issues around virtual reality and how we interact with it and so on. Okay, so let me continue. Just talking then about the audience and the viewer, the user, the experience for that. So again, if we think of typography, we think of readers, and increasingly, I suppose we juxtapose these terms viewer, user, because when we're using, I suppose, any sort of an interface that we're interacting with, we tend to substitute the term user. But also, if we think of it from a movie perspective, and virtual reality kind of is a mixture between an immersive kind of movie type experience, but also interaction. We do kind of think of, is it a viewer, is it a user, and in this case, a reader. But one of the biggest challenges in VR is how do you script the viewer into the experience, okay? And that is something that you will think about. So if you're designing a book or a poster, we know where the reader is, and we know how the reader behaves, because these are traditional kind of media that we're used to. And even now, we kind of, the whole reason why we have user experience design is because things like mobile phones and apps, there's an infinite range of types of experiences we can design for them, and they're not necessarily standardized. There's definitely elements that are becoming standardized, like, a menu, hamburger menu, back buttons, home icons, all of that. But it's very, very new if you compare it to how old, like, the codex form of the book is, and how we understand that as an interface. And even the same with TV, we kind of understand how to just sit and watch a film. So these new experiences, it's like, well, where's the audience in the experience of virtual reality? So a couple of things to think of. First of all, in virtual reality, if you put a headset on, you have a field of view, and we need to be kind of aware, I suppose, of the field of view and the fact that we turn our head and we use our neck, okay, and we will have a heavy device on. So there's some kind of basic rules around that, and understanding how many degrees we can comfortably turn our head. So there are certain things we need to understand. So if you're designing a 3D environment, again, and this is very quickly, we'll get into this later today when you start to work in Unity, but just that idea of where's your viewpoint, and what does the viewer see? So when we're trying to design these things, we're trying to design them almost architecturally or structurally to understand the audience's viewpoint. And again, turning your head right back is very difficult, but you can turn totally around. So again, just being aware of kind of the field of view, and you can just do that yourselves. Try it there while you're sitting at home, and just see, well, how far can you turn your head comfortably and look around before you want to move your whole body. So that's things to be aware of. And the same with looking up and looking down. Okay, so again, just the field of view, 20-meter limit of depth perception, 10 meters strong for depth perception, that's like across the street, and then about 3.5 or 6 meters is kind of comfortable within the size of a kind of a living room. Okay, and we spoke about presence. So again, if you think about movies, you probably are familiar with kind of the grammar of film, where you have this idea of the fourth wall, which is the audience is on the other side of that, and you never cross that wall, because if you cross over the fourth wall, then you kind of break that sense of disbelief. So all film is shot with this kind of continuity of action, that it doesn't cross over the wall, so it makes sense. So the idea here is, if you think of it like this, the audience is outside the representation, and the action happens inside here. But in VR, that changes, okay? So again, if you think of this little sphere as being the reality, suddenly the audience is inside the story. And again, that changes it. So when you're designing for VR, you need to consider that, you might have a grand plan, a helicopter view, but actually you need to understand what it's like to be inside and see it through their eyes. So that's why you need to consider not only a helicopter view, but you need to consider the first person view, you know, looking around, looking up, looking down. So all of those things you need to consider. So just in terms of audience experience, and this is something, you know, Rob will be talking to you more about as we start to construct things in Unity, you need to consider the position. So you're inside the action, the field of vision, up, down, left, right, the viewpoint, the first person. And then if you're interested in presence, it doesn't really, we're not going to go into it in too much detail, but Michael Rylak is a good reference. He's written some interesting stuff on presence, and he describes it as 10 types. But effectively, for the purposes of this, if you think of what I was saying earlier, you're going to be a disembodied player or user or viewer. So you won't have a physical body. Your audience won't, you'll be able to look around and maybe navigate, interact inside your virtual environment, but you won't actually be able to see yourself or, you know, make an impact on what's in there. Okay, so then just moving on to basic principles of typography. Okay, so have all of you studied typography or basic principles?
Yes.
Yeah. So some of you had, I imagine the students from Basel have, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what about New Media Arts? Have you covered any typography in your course?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, okay. So have you done the basic principles of typography on your course, first and second years?
I guess, but
Okay. So just to explain, in print typography, there's a lot of principles. So maybe if you haven't studied typography, you know, this is just a kind of a big list, but effectively to say is typography is a very kind of what I would call a slow discipline. You learn it in increments slowly, and you practice it and you practice it, and you have to learn through practice and training in your eye. Okay. So it takes time. So in a similar way for virtual reality, we are going to be we're going to do it like a basic principles project. So I'm going to be quite strict on you in terms of giving you some rules and some limitations. And then it means that it forces you to work harder with a small amount of choices, okay, instead of letting you do anything you like. But the basic principles in typography, for example, the first thing would be you'd learn about the typeface. So what is a typeface? You know, what's its personality, understanding its letter forms, its shape, its weight, its style, and so on. And then usually when we're designing typography for print or for texts, we learn about body text, which would be reading text. And we would consider things like line length, line spacing, the size of the typeface, and its color. And when I say color, I mean how black it is, okay? And that would have to do with the type of typeface that we choose. So those two things go hand in glove, the size of the typeface, the length of the line, the setting. So if we were designing a book or a magazine or a newspaper, we'd be the column width would be the length of our line, and then the space between the lines would be, you know, would represent what the body text looks like and how dark or light it would be based on the amount of spacing we give it. Then we consider things like hierarchy, which would be headings, subheadings, and so on, and contrast and tone. So again, you know, we might have a larger size for a display heading, or we might make it bold. We might change the weight of the typeface and so on. So we understand hierarchy. And again, very traditionally, when you're learning typography, you know, you would work with one typeface and maybe 3 sizes, maximum of 3 sizes, until you learn how to use those and it's consistent. Things like we would learn about emphasis. So, you know, editorial tropes, things like quotations, bullet points, drop capitals, and so on. These are all ways that we can give emphasis to typography when it's on the page, to draw our eye to it. And similarly, we can have expressive typography, where we use type to create an image or a mood or an atmosphere. And we're going to cross over both of these areas in this project. Then we also think about navigational and structural aspects of type. So again, in books, things like table contents, page numbers, and so on, running heads, they're all of the architecture that we're used to in books for finding our way around. So we all understand page numbers, we understand table contents, we understand how to look up an index, you know, all of that. And that's because there's years and years, centuries of tradition of book design, and we understand the interface very well. So on things like a phone, you know, iPad apps. We're learning those in those kind of navigational infrastructure interface elements. We're learning them, but they're still not completely standardized. So, you know, they do differ, and they you know, trends come and go, but we're learning them, and they are becoming more and more standardized. Things like format, the paper size, the materials, the extent of the number of pages, the binding, all of that we know from paper. And then, you know, on the screen, we have to think of things like, you know, the screen size, or if it's responsive, you know, you might be designing a web app and it's going to be displayed on any type of computer and any type of phone. So your layouts have to be elastic, you know, they have to be responsive. And you'll consider things like motion, sound, animation, and 3 dimensions, okay? And then interactivity, which will be the navigation, finding your way around, playing it back, manipulating it, and so on. Okay, so basic principles across print and screen. And they're things that I suppose they take a lot of time and a lot of practice to learn. So in virtual reality, I suppose the kind of key considerations we are thinking about in a reading context would be the plan. So what is the plan? So we need to, it's going to be in space. So we're going to put text or words, letters in space. So we need to think about, well, what is that space and how do we plan it out? And can you walk through that space? So again, what would be, so if you think about a book, the journey through a book, you start on page 1, you maybe go to page 300 at the, you know, you work your way page after page. If it's a book that maybe doesn't need to be read sequentially, you might jump into the middle, you might browse it, you might flick through it and go to different parts. But you still understand where you are in the scheme of the book because of its structure and its architecture. And the same in a, you know, in an app or a website, hopefully you'll understand from the navigation, the primary navigation, secondary navigation, where you are, or even a sitemap, you'll understand where you are. And it's a bit more complex again on a phone because you've only got one screen. So effectively you see one page at a time. So the viewer or the reader has to conceptualize, well, where's all the other pages? Do I understand? Do I have a mental model in my head of where everything is? So here we're talking about a virtual space that we're going to create. And you need to think about, well, what's the plan for that space? And how is the reader going to move through that space and read the text? So where will they start their journey? Where can they go to next? Will it make sense if they decide to go backwards, you know, or over to the side and so on? So these are all things that we need to consider. Structure. And again, we're going to think about 2D. So we can have 2D text in a 3D space. So we could have 2D text stuck on a wall, exactly like you would in the real world. But we could also have 3D text. So we could have 3-dimensional text objects or structures that we can move around. So again, structuring 2D and 3D is a little bit more complex than we would normally think about. We also have to think about scale. So again, scale here has a different meaning. So we're used to things like point size or pixel size, but now we're talking about scale in relation to the human body. Okay, so you know, what does it feel like if I read something that's, you know, at my eye level, and how big should it be? And do I need to walk up really close to it? Or can I see it from across the road? You know, all of that. So we need to understand and experiment with scale. And then similarly, field of view. What happens if I put typography above my head and I'm reading it on the ceiling, or it's on the floor and I'm looking down at it, or I'm left, right? So again, understanding the viewpoint. So these are all new kind of considerations. And as I say, then navigation, you know, am I walking around? Is it my gaze? Do I need to approach something? All of that. Hierarchy. How do you design hierarchy? So, you know, if you have a number of sections in a text, or you want to have a heading, you know, how do you display that or design that into a physical space? The choice of typeface and the style that you use, again, is going to be very important. I have curated a list of typefaces, so I'm going to ask you to stick to only using those. And we're going to avoid very ornate or very typefaces that have lots of quirks and overt personality. So we're going to focus on ones that are good, what I would call workhorse typefaces. You know, that they're well designed, well balanced, and have a lot of weight, so that we can work and focus purely in on structure and form. Okay, lighting and color are going to be a key area that you're going to explore, because that's how you're going to create mood and atmosphere. Because again, we're going to steer away from we're not going to let you use kind of representations like photographs or drawings or anything. We're going to ask you to just focus on type and color and light, okay, and structure. So in a way, it's a little bit like doing a basic typographic exercise. If you think of some of the exercises and compositions you would have done in print, well, this is kind of similar, okay? And the key thing, folks, over the week is we're just going to experiment, because it's going to be a lot of trial and error, trying things out, seeing what it feels like, and you know, iterating over that again. Okay, so just to say then, you know, the possibility of VR typography is this kind of embodiment of information, okay? And we understand with our bodies. So again, move and think about that, and think of you as a person and say, right, well, what would it feel like if I put words in my world, in my environment? You know, oh, I can see it, I can grasp it, you know, it's clearer to me as I approach it. So think about it in terms of the body and how the body might react to words. Okay, is everybody okay at the moment? Has anybody any questions? Is that clear what I'm explaining? Because sorry, I can't see any of you or hear any of you, so it's kind of hard.
Everything is clear.
Everything is okay?
Yeah.
Anybody
Yeah.
jumping?
Yes.
Anybody want a question, or anybody burning for a question?
Good.
All okay? Will I keep going? Yeah. Okay. All right, I'll keep going. So then just some principles, folks, that we'll think about, as I said, around the idea of embodied information. So space is a spatial environment that we can move through. So you've got to think about typography in a space. Structure, again, it's not necessarily the grid, you know, in terms of page hierarchy, those types of structures. It's physical structures in that space, you know. So thinking about that scale, well, I mentioned that already in relation to the human body and viewpoint. And then navigation. So again, it may not be relevant, but it's something to think about. You know, how do we lead somebody through? So again, there's tried and tested methods in things like exhibition design and experience design, service design, how you lead somebody through a space. But we need to think about that. And then remembering that, you know, your format, there's no edges, there's no page, it's the physical space. But things like, you know, legibility are still really important. So again, the choice of typeface, understanding skeuomorphism. So if somebody, you know, Rob was saying there, you only focus really, there's a small kind of view when you're looking at something. So things in your periphery are skewed, and depending on the angle you come at them. And then if you walk behind it and your type is see-through, you're going to see backwards typography, so reversals. So things like that you need to consider. Okay, this one, 5 minutes. Yeah, I'm going to skip over that. Sorry, I don't think that's relevant for this talk. Okay, so let's talk then about spatial typography and some examples. And again, this is kind of just to walk you through some of the basic concepts and to get you thinking about it, because you may not, or you may have worked in 3 dimensions before, or you might find it hard. You know, if you've been working primarily in 2D, you might find it hard to kind of conceptualize 3D. So we'll just look at some ideas here about how you can think about it and how we're going to work. Okay, so let's talk about 2-dimensional typography on 3D structures. So the students in Basel, obviously Wolfgang Weingart is a very famous lecturer from Basel, typographer and designer, but his M project is a very nice example of conceptualizing 2D typography into the 3D realm. And he did a very simple thing. He just printed out the letter M and he stuck it on a cube, okay? And then from that, he took photographs of it. And he could see, so this is without any 3D software or anything, you can just start to see how the letter M distorts depending on how you turn the cube and how you photograph it. And you can see examples there of all of the kind of anthropomorphic versions of the M stretching that he gets just purely from putting it on a 3-dimensional object. And you'll see this in graphic design. But I think what's really interesting, these are some of Weingart's compositions. They're very spatial. They're very structural. They feel like a physical environment. So you really get a sense of, I could walk through this little pathway, you know, with this fence built of M's. And again, you know, he's using very simple, just sketching. And again, we're going to do a lot of sketching, just sketching out those ideas. But some of his compositions, and again, they're all kind of derived, these are compositions in 2D, but they create these kind of the sense of space or a dimensional feel. And you can see the tensions here, he's turning things on its side, and you know, you're getting a sense of gravity and space. So some very interesting kind of experiments just with one letter form and sort of exploring that in three-dimensional space. And even with one color, as I say, just here, you get a real sense of form and contrast. And again, so this is why we're trying to give you a reduced palette so that you focus in on the structural and the spatial aspects, and then you can start to introduce light and color. And you know, you can imagine, if you imagine even some of these compositions, imagine they were three-dimensional, and what would happen if you could walk through them or move through them and they were lit with shadows and so on. So again, I just thought that was a nice little example in terms of thinking about just letter forms, 2D letter forms in a 3D on a 3D structure, and how that translates into space. Some other examples then. This is Paula Scher, and this is the New Jersey Art Center, and again, it's you know, this is theatre where dance and so on happens, so performance, and she's kind of put these kind of keywords on the outside. So it's kind of using the structure of the building to donate kind of what the experience on the inside is. And again, it's just a simple application of two-dimensional type onto a 3D surface or 3D structure. And it makes quite an interesting, interesting design. Okay. Yeah, and then just some close-ups. So again, if you're having problems trying to kind of conceptualize, you can make some very simple structures, and you can, you know, put the type on those structures to help you see what that looks like, and you could take the structures away or leave them there if you want to. But again, you know, has anybody seen this building in real life? Anybody?
I wish I had.
Yeah. Well, again, so this photograph doesn't do it justice, but it's just, again, and this is where I suppose, this is where, you know, it's one thing to make a picture of something. It's another thing to stand underneath this in physical space and see its scale and to experience it, you know. So I think that's what's important here is I'm showing you images, but really nothing can replace the sense of viewpoint and you kind of standing beside and walking around this structure. So we looked at kind of 2D type on 3D structures, and then here's another one. This is, I suppose, type as light. It's just a projection, and it's projection onto 3D structures. But again, you know, there's lots, you can see here the type distorts and it bends around the surfaces and so on. But you know, again, this is an image of something. The physical experience of standing beneath this and seeing these giant letter forms in a building in the dark at nighttime is quite the experience. And this is by the American artist Jenny Holzer, and she has done lots of kind of environmental, I suppose, typographic art projects, where she projects these truisms and kind of statements onto buildings and in environments. So again, you can see some examples, and this gives you some sort of sense here. You can see the person; it gives you some sort of sense, and you can see the secondary, you know, experience getting these lovely shadows because of the way it's lit, and the double projection onto the ground, you know, the reflection. So again, these are all possible things that can happen when you start to create a virtual environment, and some of them will be serendipitous because you stick a light behind a structure and you get these shadows, and you know, it can create a really nice visual effect, and you mightn't have intended it, but until you physically start trying it, that's when you'll see these things happen. And then this was another project she did in the Guggenheim, where she, again, I don't know if any of you have been in the Guggenheim, but it's kind of a circular atrium. You know, the floors go around like this, and she put this kind of ticker tape the whole way around. So as you can walk gradually up the spiral of the Guggenheim, you could read these truisms that she projected on a strip in the LED strips all the way up. And again, you know, it's a very interesting physical experience or spatial experience of typography, you know, looking up through this and then actually walking around it. So again, it's very simple, but again, it's quite a powerful kind of reading experience. and some other, and again, this is a different viewpoint of the same thing. So you can see how different it is depending on where you are within the space. You can have these could be like, you know, multiple layouts if you think about it, if you were to kind of make it analogous with the page. So really, really interesting in terms of your experience of the typography depending on where you are in the space. Okay, so let's look at a few examples then of 2D in a 3D space. And again, this is Paula Scher and Keith Hartwick. And Paula Scher is very famous for her hand-painted maps and their paintings, and they you know, really painstaking. But she started doing also physical spaces. So I think this is really interesting to see, you know, these maps, these hand-painted typographic maps in a physical space on floors and walls. And then when people walk within them, it brings a level of interactivity. So it's essentially 2D, but it's projected into a 3D space, and it's mapped into a 3D space. So there's not much structure here. It's reliant on the two-dimensional representation of the typography mapped onto the surfaces. And again, this is something you can also do during this project, but just to consider that. And what it feels like, you know, walking around that. Barbara Kruger is another American artist who also explores the use of text as installation for her art. And again, you know, her work, you know, you'll see it all over the place. This is an installation in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam called Past, Present, Future. And again, her work, it's very aggressive. It's quite provocative, and you can see here, again, look at the typography. So can everybody see it's all caps? And it's a mixture of, you know, she's got using condensed type forms on the floor, and then she's using extended character widths on the wall. So you're getting, so she's also playing with the distortion of space and perspective through the typographic forms that she's actually applying to the walls. So you can see here, you know, really, and then the black and white, it's really quite aggressive. So again, imagine standing here and looking at these kind of, you know, your face of the future, a boot, you know, it's really, really full on in terms of an experience. And just some other examples here. This is in a piece in Washington, and it's called Belief and Doubt. And again, you know, so again, this is an image, but imagine what it's like to walk through the space. You can see there what it must feel like. Okay, another example. This is a very famous installation in England in a seaside town called Blackpool, and it's called the Comedy Carpet, and it's designed by Gordon Young with a design agency called Why Not Associates. Gordon Young is a British designer, or a British artist, I should say, who does a lot of installation work and sculptural work with letter forms and typography and messaging. And he works with the graphic design firm Why Not Associates. So this is an aerial view of the Comedy Carpet, and again, it's on the it's just beside the sea on the promenade there, and it's full of you know, anecdotes and little clips from literature and of comedy. So and poetry and stuff. It's really quite interesting. And it's, again, people love it, and they've really taken to it. It's really engaging. So you can see, as I say, this is just very, very simple, but it's just the idea of standing on the words and walking through them. Think about the experience of the human in your space. So when you go to design some words in your space, think about the human experience and what your intention is. So now we're going to just talk about 2D and 3D examples in 3D space. Okay, so interestingly, you know, when I was looking around, some of the examples that I liked the best, or that I suppose I dug out, I noticed afterwards a lot of them had to do with I suppose death, as in monuments or memorials for people who have died. So and then I was reflecting on that and thinking, well, you know, maybe that is it's because culturally we've traditionally used, you know, tombstones to put typography, you know, on, so physical structural things where we've put type in the environment, you know, to represent people. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. This one you're probably all familiar with, but I thought it was worth speaking about because of its it's use of the spatial environment and the physical environment to create hierarchy. So this is a war memorial for the Vietnam War. It was designed in 1982 by Maya Ying Lin, and it's in Washington. And it, as I say, it commemorates the soldiers who died during the Vietnam War. But it's kind of unusual for a couple of reasons. One is that it organizes the names based off of their time of death and who they I suppose died chronologically when they died. So it's not typical of other types of memorials where they just list all the names alphabetically. And the reason that Lynn did that is she thought it was more empathetic to the soldiers to put them together with the people that they died in the field with. And it creates this kind of, I suppose, story, both chronologically in terms of, you know, when the soldiers died, but you can see in terms of the scale as well, how many. So over the trajectory of the time frame of the war, you can also see how it increased, and so on. So it's also it's in black granite, polished granite. So creates these amazing kind of reflections. So you can see here is probably a better photograph, and you can see there that it's cut into the hillside. So again, you walk down into it, but you get this sense of it. It's at a level, if you like, the top part of it as a level, but it's going deeper into the earth as the number of casualties increase. And then it's tactile in that the visitors can put their hand on the wall and they can feel the typography that's carved into the surface, set in all caps, and again just simply the names side by side, based on the panel. So it's a very sensitive, and the reflection in the black granite of the lovely green environment. So you get this real juxtaposition of the two. So I think it's a very nice example of spatial typography that takes cognizance of the physical experience of walking alongside this structure and reading the structure. And so it takes in the kind of the total view and then the micro view in terms of the experience of looking at an individual name. Again, another example, this is the Hyde Park Memorial, and this is for the victims of the London bombings in 2005. And again, it's designed by Phil Baines, who's a fairly well-known UK typographer. But this is just basically 52 steel kind of concrete structures, and they're clustered together based on the locations of the bombings. You can see here the type, you know, on the side of the structures, just saying the time and the date and the place. And again, there's a plaque then that kind of sits to the side here. You can see it in the grass, which lists the names of the people who died. And you can see here again, great attention to detail around the typography, you know, and, you know, the legibility of it being read on its side. And again, just that little, you know, why did he put it on its side? Again, it's just that because it you know, reading it, you have to take a moment and you have to turn your head. So you have to take that little extra bit of effort and that pause, which I think is appropriate to the monument and the meaning of what it stands for. And again, it's one typeface, one size, you know, beautifully considered in terms of its spacing and its alignment and its position to the viewpoint of a reader, eye height, and it would be again the average adult eye height. Okay, another example by Gordon Young. This is a wall of wishes in a school in Bristol, and basically it asked the students to basically write down on a piece of paper what their wishes were for the future, and then he designed. It's in the foyer of the school. It's a wall of wishes, and they carved these into little panels on the wall, and again, it's really interactive and it's really engaging when you go into the school, and the students love it, you know. And again, they're anonymous. So, you know, some people made funny ones, some people made heartfelt ones, some people made crazy ones, you know. And again, there's just something there. And, you know, you can go in, walk in the morning and read that, and you can put a smile on your face, or it can make you think for the day. So again, very nice piece. And again, the typography is beautifully, you know, beautifully executed. The spacing, the selection of typeface, materials, all of that, very sensitive to the environment. And you can see here, this is the foyer of the school. And he then, in complete contrast to that, made a sculpture, which is hopes and dreams. So this is the kind of, feel like, the heading for the installation, but it's in completely contrasting materials, and it's almost like a totem pole. So it's got a really interesting contrast between the physical form and the visual form. Okay, another example is this is in Milton Keynes, and it's called the Milton Keynes Rose, and it also commemorates, it's on an archaeological site there, and it commemorates people who died there. But it's organized over a rose. Like if you see this from the air, it's I think I have a shot here. You can see this. It's the concept of Milton Keynes rose, and it's organized like a geometry based off of this idea of the rose. And again, it's in honor of people who died there, and there's really nice kind of little pillars. They're of varying sizes to kind of make it playful with these quotations on them from, again, various times and from various people about various things. So it makes it a very interactive space that people can wander through, as well as being quite poignant. And at the center there, you'll see there's a sculpture. So it's very, very tactile as well. The physical stones are very tactile. And again, kids get great enjoyment, you know, wandering through it, walking on the lines and looking at the space. So it kind of has something for everybody. It works on a number of levels. So I think it's a very interesting example, again, of a reading experience in a spatial environment that you can move through. Okay, and again, just the plan view. So this is kind of your design process. You're going to be considering, well, what is the experience? What is the physical space I'm designing? And then also, what might it look like? So let's imagine if I was to do a freeze frame, what's the treatment of it? What's the mood of it? What's the color of it? What are the materials? What does it feel like? What's the typeface? But then, you know, you're going to have to do a schematic like this to physically understand, well, where am I going to put these structures or pieces of typography in a plan that people can walk around? So this will be part of our process through the week. So we'll be getting you to draw plans and sketches and, you know, key frames, if you like, to imagine what it's going to look like, and design mock-ups, and then we'll build those in Unity. Okay, this is just a fun example of typographic furniture, alphabet chairs. I just thought kind of a nice little example, and also because I was kind of trying to look for examples that are a little more light-hearted than some of the examples that I've shown you. Okay, so then just virtual spatial typography. I thought, you know, there are some examples, and I thought it was worth talking about. So really, David Small is one of, I suppose, he's a well-known designer of virtual typographic environments. He would have been a student of Muriel Cooper's at MIT, who is I suppose, the most renowned academic who started this kind of process with her information landscapes project, and David Small was her PhD student. But what he says of virtual spatial typography is it's inventing new ways for people to read, interact with, and assimilate information. And some of his principles here, he did his PhD on this area. I think I'm going to skip over those and I'll come back to them because they make more sense when I show you. But these are some of his ideas. So this piece, again, I think I sent you a little link to watch this video. But effectively, this piece was made in 1994, which is quite incredible if you think about it. And the computing power needed at the time to make this was very, very significant. So it was made a collaboration between Muriel Cooper and her then PhD student, David Small. And what it is it's a spatial website, essentially. So you can navigate a website spatially. And you start to see the type move in 3 dimensions. You can turn it around, and you get this idea of layering. So, you know, you can move through space, and and layers of typography. You can turn them around. So lots of kind of really interesting new concepts for typography emerging here. Did you get a chance to watch that clip? Any of you? Yeah. Or some of it?
I watched it. I don't know for other. No one talk here. So.
Okay. So it just give you some idea here. This one here. So fortunately, David, I ran the 2018 Motive Conference in Dublin, and David was one of the speakers, and he demoed it. So it was quite interesting to see it. So this idea of flying into the type, and again, this was on a screen, so it wasn't virtual reality, but you get this sense of, my goodness, the type is freed from the page and what it means. So it's quite a radical shift in terms of a reading experience, and yet you could read it, and you can see the gentle physics here, how things, accelerate and decelerate, so the movement feels quite natural. But again, it blows concepts of, like, so for example, you can see, can you see the clip moving? I'm sure there's a lag time on it, but can you see it, folks? You can see it? Okay.
Yes, running fine.
Okay, great. So what I'm trying to point out here really is, you can see here, as you get nearer to something, you can see faint typography in the background. And then that's that idea of distance, So again, imagining you're walking through a space, you can have typography, so page 2 might be further away than page 1 and so on. So these are concepts of physical distance and viewpoint, and just also how animation might work in a space. Okay, so I'll move on. But anyway, it's worth having a look. And this is his PhD project, which was a kind of a 3-dimensional interactive visualization of the Talmud, and it was called Rethinking the Book. And again, he put kind of verses of the Talmud into a virtual space that you could manipulate around and walk around. Some more examples from Muriel Cooper's lab. This is a piece. This is essentially an Excel spreadsheet in 3 dimensions by one of her students, Lisa Strausfeld, again, who went on to become a very well-known designer in the area of data visualization. And she was also a speaker. We were also privileged to have her as a speaker at Motive in 2018 in Dublin. So again, these are just examples of kind of putting typography. So this idea of a timeline in physical space. So again, if you think of these as years, and you could actually go onto that floor and you could see the data on that year, and you can see the example there. So again, this is an example of imagining, again, typography as nodes connected in a network. And again, it's just another idea of freeing type from the linear page and putting it in space and connecting pieces of type together. So some concepts there to think about. And again, this is an example of, again, just experimenting with type in space, headings of an article, body text, and how do you navigate it. And again, you can start to see how complex it becomes. So you can see grid lines here, it becomes infinitely complex and can become quite difficult to read. So these are all things that we need to consider when we talk about type in kind of virtual space. Okay, so again, I hope that gives you some ideas. So if I go back just to some of the concepts there that we were looking at and just explain some of them. So, form, obviously the choice of typeface, the visual presentation of the typography is really important. So your choice of type, the weight of that type, the spacing of it, and how you set it in 3D space is really important, So you could see there in some of the examples, if you choose a really thin weight, and then when that's skewed or it goes on its side, it looks like a line. It almost vanishes into the ether, So these are things that you actually have to do physical experiments with to see what they look like, So a lot of the examples we've been looking at have used heavier weights, and they've used, some of the examples earlier we saw, so they've used, consistent spacing. They've used things like just shading to create depth and distance. And how do you access type, so how do you move through it? Do you turn it around? Do you look up? Do you look down? Do you walk around it? So all of these things are are things to consider. You know, and what does it mean if it becomes blurred, you know, when it's not in our focus, you know, and is that a problem or not? And things being bright, you know, so again, if you, we'll be getting into things like setting up lights in Unity, but what happens if it's too dark and you can't read it? Or perhaps that's intentional and maybe you have to stand under it to read it. So all of those kind of considerations are things we need to think about. I think one of the biggest things we need to think about is the Z-axis, you know, and that's the idea of, you know, depth, because if you're used to designing on even on a phone or an iPad or a web page, we don't tend to use the Z-axis that much, the depth. Where we would use it maybe is in motion graphics, you know, we would tend to use it. But here we have an opportunity to use it as, you know, to put typography in the Z-axis, into space, and for it to put the reader into that space and to traverse the Z-axis. So that's quite an interesting concept that you will find, I think, as you start to experiment over the week. And then things like movement. So again, Rob will show you some physics in Unity. It's quite interesting, you know, so that idea of, you know, things reacting to movement, you know, and feeling naturalistic. So, you know, things that, you know, bounce, they come to a gradual stop and all of that. And then just tangible issues. So we won't explore using things like, you know, handheld controllers. We're just going to be using, you know, the simple kind of walking around and looking around. But again, it is that idea of thinking about, you know, well, what would it be like? So hopefully you guys will take ideas forward to the future when you do have the opportunity to expand on some of the concepts that we cover in the workshop. Okay, and I promise you I'm nearly finished. Yeah, okay. So then I just want to talk about structural typography. And again, this is where we kind of move into the realm of making structures from the letter forms and the words. And again, you know, these can be legible or they can be sculptural, they can be interpretive, and then just some examples. So good example in print, I think, of structural typography would be the likes of Willy Kuntz. He would have also been a student at Basel and a professor in Yale design, but you know, his work is very systematic in terms of structurally building up layers to compose his compositions. And this is in a 2D surface. But you can see, even looking at these three compositions and these other compositions, so this is from a series of typographic posters, that the structural elements are very clear and he's building them up. So this is like his palette of visual elements, and he constructs them in different ways based off of a grid. He's organizing them. So we can think of that kind of process, but and you can see the infinite variations he's getting out of using just different aspects. But we can think about structural elements and using them in, as I said, in virtual space. This is an identity by spin. And again, it's the idea of using just the C as a structural element that keeps changing. And again, it's quite interesting what's coming out. So this is quite interpretive, but it's quite interesting in that it forms the identity and it's spatial and it's moving, and then it's transferred onto surfaces. You'll also have seen examples of, you know, typography that's extruded, you know, so that becomes a structure. And again, these are things that you can experiment with. You may not want to do it, you know, or you might do a combination, but we're just saying that these are things that you can do. And what does that mean in terms of the reader? What does it offer the reader? You know, and how do you weave it into your design? Okay, so again, this is another aspect that we can look at. And again, the idea of putting three-dimensional structures on 2D structures, you know, again, you would see this very much in the environment. You would see very typically this tactility, this sense of being able to walk to a wall and touch the letter forms. And again, I spoke about the Vietnam monument. There's something beautiful about stone carving that it's so tactile, it makes you want to touch the lettering. You know, and this is an example of a building in India, the Newton School. And again, the typography is on the exterior. Okay, and then I'm just going to finish up with some examples of VR typography. So probably one of the most famous examples, the earliest examples, 1989, is by the artist Geoffrey Shaw, and this piece is called Legible City. Now, I'm not going to play the video for you, because I sent you a link, maybe you looked at it. But he had this idea of recreating New York City on the grid, and with quotes from different people. Actually, Trump is featured in here. Imagine back in 1989 when he was, you know, I suppose more famous for being a capitalist businessman more than anything else. But again, it's interesting. So his interface here is a bicycle. And again, it's not immersive, as in it's not a headset. But the idea here is that the bike, it has a map. You can see here the map. And the audience or the viewer or the reader can traverse the city of letters and words and read the streets, essentially. So it's called the legible city. So it's a really kind of interesting concept. And again, he's using structural typography laid out on this map-like environment, and you can drive through it and do a read-through, a drive-through, and read as you go. And again, you know, just in terms of what it looks like there, you know, so again, we're looking behind him, so we don't have the sense of immersion. Sorry, oops. You don't have the sense of immersion, but you can see that if you were sitting on the bicycle and you have this big screen, it's filling most of your viewpoint, so it feels like you're moving through the space. Okay, I'm not going to play this one either. This is another film I sent you. This was it's a little virtual reality film about love at first sight, and it uses typography to kind of to sort of, I suppose, represent all the little emotions that are firing off, the physical emotions that are firing off. It's quite a nice little piece, but I'll leave you watch that yourselves. So I'm just going to skip on. Yeah, I wanted to talk then, I just wanted to draw your attention to this piece. So this is a designer based in Microsoft, and I suppose he's a young designer, but he's been doing a lot of experiments with the HoloLens. And he made a virtual museum of type. And the reason I'm showing you this project is not that it's particularly good, but I think it's a good example of process. So you can see here, he designed a 3D space. This is an exhibition about the history of typography and typefaces, okay? And you can see his plan view here with the walls and so on. And if I go back, you can see his sketches. So he's imagining how the text will be laid out on the walls. This is the kind of process that we're going to use. And you can see he's using Unity here to build it. So you're going to be doing these kind of drawings and drawing a plan, and then we'll be constructing it in the Unity environment like this. So I thought that was a good example just to show you in terms of process, the kind of process that we're going to follow. Okay, and again, you can look at that example yourselves. And this one it's quite jerky, I think. You know, he's kind of jerking all over the place because he's just kind of recorded the screen, but it also gives you an idea of what it's like to be in the environment. And anybody want to say anything they noticed about that maybe was a problem for them if they looked at it? Does anybody have a comment on that piece if you looked at it?
The only problem I feel like when I watched it, he make it faster, the videos. It was really hard to follow in.
Yes.
But it was actually cool because also later he dropped some letters and you can
Yes.
feel he made the gravity. So sometimes
Yes.
they fall and stuff. So
Yes.
the idea was nice, but I think it was quite confusing, the space, how it's organized.
Yes.
And it went
Yes.
way too fast.
Yeah, and so it's interesting you say it's confusing how it's organized, and yet, you know, he had a plan. So this is what I mean, folks. You know, you can have the best of intentions. So you see this plan here? He has organized it in little clusters, okay? But that's great on paper when you have the helicopter view. It's quite another thing when you're down at the viewpoint of the person in the space. So now you're not going to do anything maybe as complex as this. Well, you might, I don't know, we'll see how you get on. But it's all the time being aware of that you create a space that is understandable, you know, that is navigable, that is understandable to the reader. So that's part of your challenge, is to understand the physical space and how to organize it in such a way that there is some logical, and also to be aware that, you know, you can't control people. So people will look left and will look right. How many of you have been to exhibitions and, you know, the designers spend they spend, you know, months and months designing this beautiful narrative that you walk through and you follow, and then people go, I'm going to go this way, or I'm going to go backwards, or I'm going to start over here and then go, and they interrupt the narrative. And that happens all the time. And that's what interaction is about. So you need to be mindful of that. If somebody reads the last word first or jumps to the middle, you know, what will they take away? So you also have to be mindful of having a view to to the total experience as well as to the micro experience of them moving through. So do you follow me? So this is it's kind of fun to do that too. And to think that, you know, a spatial environment, while we don't have senses as in we can smell it and touch and feel, it's virtual, but you do have that physical sense of being there and moving and looking. So they're the senses that we're going to think about, and, you know, creating a nicely lit atmospheric environment with your words in that space is what your challenge is effectively, you know, and it sounds a lot easier than it looks. So so the other thing I think, other observation I would have about that piece is the sense of the floor. So can you see there's no floor here? So this feels like, you know, everything is skewed. Like it feels like the panels are falling over because he didn't. There's no sense of anchor. So sometimes they feel anchored here, and then other times they feel like they're falling over because the viewers kind of rocking, if you like. So again, these are things that, you know, you'll notice as you start to experiment. You know, and they're not that easy. They're not that easy to do. Okay, I'll just skip on. Sorry. Yeah, I'll just skip on. That was again, I think I sent you a little example of that. He was trying to create a news headline experience, and again, just that idea of having all of the you know, the headlines from your newspaper just around you in your surrounding environment, and what that feels like as a reading experience, you know. So. Okay, so I'll just finish up then. Lisa Strausfeld, virtual reality can explore the opportunities for embodied understanding of 3D information space. So again, I think I've been saying that kind of over and over. Again, I included an example of a project that she did recently, and she presented that at Motive. And this was a representation of a virtual reality representation of women on a timeline in history. So women who have been overlooked in relation to kind of key inventions. So you can see them in history, and you can see kind of how they relate to perhaps the male counterpart. So did anybody have a chance to look at that? I'm just curious. Anyone? Do you want to make a comment on it? Anybody?
I mean, I feel there's nobody here except me.
Yeah. Okay.
I did watch it, and it was really super interesting.
Yeah.
The video, and I think also I like the aesthetic.
Yes.
To do this,
Yes.
it was really light and really
Yes.
brief.
Yes.
So it was really nice.
So again, it's very experimental. You could also argue that it's quite difficult to follow. So, you know, there's aspects of it that feel really, as you say, the aesthetic is really pared back, and, you know, it's really nice. But then also you can see there's problems with some parts in terms of readability. But there's also a very nice thing when you go behind the typography, it flips over, so you never see it in reverse. So they implemented that really nice little device. But again, I think it's a very interesting example of, as I say, of typography in spatial environment, and again, hierarchy and traveling along a timeline. Okay, so again, very, very interesting example. Okay, that was an example of the. Hold on, I think I might play this one for you. So this, yeah. Okay, so there's only some very small examples in there, but again, this is an example of where Vacheron Constantin, the watchmaker in Switzerland, they had their archives and they wanted to make them explorable by the public. So they built a virtual reality experience of the history of kind of their archives and making watches. And you can see all their documentation and so on. And I think the sensibility here, it's very appropriate to the content, you know, the color palette and so on. But again, you can see them designing in Unity, and you can see kind of the issues that they're talking about, that, they didn't want the technology to get in the way. They wanted the audience to have the experience. And here you can see the timeline here. There's an attempt at hierarchy. Things are above and below, and there's bold type, and then there's type on the timeline that is smaller, and so on. So you can see how typography, the kind of some of the principles of hierarchy are being played out in a 3D environment. Okay, so just to wrap up, folks, then, just to go back over, these are the key considerations that you're going to be focused on this week in terms of design. So as I say, we'll be thinking about the text, but we will be thinking about how do we plan that out in space. So thinking about a floor plan, a space plan, and how do you move through that space and see those elements or read those elements. You'll be thinking about structures too in 3D. You'll be thinking about scale and viewpoint in relation to the person. As I said, navigation, so on hierarchy. So how do you lead somebody through this experience, and how do you cater for the fact that they might just not want to go the way you want to lead them and do their own thing. And then what sort of visual atmosphere, aesthetic can you create through your choice of type and just through structure and lighting and color. And the only way you're going to do that is to experiment. So I would say to all of you, as you embark on this project, is not to be afraid. There's no mistakes. The thing is to have fun and to experiment, and we work together, and we'll critique, your little sketches and things as you go, and we'll discuss them, and you can try out different things and change them. As I say, Rob is going to be teaching you how to use Unity, and we'll focus primarily on that. We did also ask you to include SketchUp and to install that. And the only reason we're going to use SketchUp is just if you wanted to create a structural element, because you can't extrude typography in Unity, but you can build all of the structural elements and light your scene and all of that. So we're going to do all of the construction and everything in, and you can create text assets, 2D text assets in a 3-dimensional space in Unity, but you can't create physical models of type. So we would do, if you do want to do that and you're familiar with another 3D program like Blender or Maya or 3D Max or whatever, Cinema 4D, I don't know what you use, that's fine. But if you're not and you just wanted to do something simple, we can do that in SketchUp.